Okay, hello, hello. All right, so I wanted to take some time and recap the Cold War era. This is just way too important if you've missed instruction for you not to hear my teaching on it. And so I'm going to walk through our Cold War notes. Now, if you've been to every single Zoom, this will be all repeat information. Feel free to skip this video. I'm recording this specifically for my students who have reached out to me and you've had tech issues, you can't figure out Zoom, Zoom wasn't letting you in, whatever the issues were, whether it was your internet connectivity or Zoom itself, or you're just not tech savvy, whatever it is, I wanted to make sure that you had an easy way to go ahead and hear the instruction on this so that you were best prepared because we are finishing strong, right? Okay, so at this point, you should have already seen all of the assignments for the section quizzes and everything, so I'm going to focus strictly on our notes. Please, if you haven't already, pause this video, print out all your notes, and then come back because these that's entirely where I'm doing my message or my instruction today is coming straight from the notes that I've given you for the entire Cold War era. It is a lot of notes, so go ahead and make sure you have those with you. I'm going to chat about some of them, most of them, and some of them were homework assignments. So I will leave those for you to do on your own devices and you will upload that individually. But we'll cover that when we get there. Okay, so you should have your notes with you already printed out. And you are more than welcome to use my notes that I have also been uploading for you to use and rewrite, or feel free in my as I'm teaching right now, feel free to scribble notes. If you want to, use your textbook, use the internet, whatever you're wanting to put it in your own words, you're more than welcome to do that too. But I did give you my class notes in case you prefer that, which is what we would normally do on a Friday at co-op. Okay, so your first sheet is the early Cold War vocab. At this point in the year, you know what to do with that, right? We're cutting and pasting, and behind each word, behind that flap, you're writing the definition. Now, these are all terminology that we're getting ready to cover in this video. So all of this will probably be new to you. One or two of them you've probably heard about because of different things going on in history or maybe political statements that people have made. Iron Curtain, I'm sure you've heard people might rule with an iron fist, right? That's a cliche that is very well known. It means they're really stubborn. Their will is impenetrable. There's probably no way we're changing their mind. That kind of goes into play with what we're getting ready to talk about. So before I chat about our next page, overall, what you need to know, the big picture of the Cold War, it is different than any other war we've talked about at this point in the year because it was not a war filled with battle after battle after battle, physically at least. There were a couple of things in there that were physical battles where soldiers were fighting against each other, and we will talk about that. But the majority of the Cold War era was not battles, which is where we get the word cold. It was not physical action. The Cold War is really the fight against communism, primarily the Americans against the Soviets is primarily what the battle was between. It was between our government and their government. But really, the big picture of the Cold War era is the world fighting against the spread of communism in any other countries. Okay, so that's what Cold War is. It was the fight against communism and trying to spread communism or trying to prevent communism from spreading to other countries. And one of the things that is important for you to know, actually, we will get to that. Okay, that's the biggie on the Cold War. Another interesting thing about the Cold War that is different from any other wars is that there's really no like start date and end dates. Now you'll remember we just wrapped up World War II, and so you'll remember that there was a very specific event that started World War II, and there was a very specific event that ended World War II. There are ending and starting dates for most wars, but the Cold War is more of an era in history. There's no one defining day that it started and or ended. Now, the ending, there were kind of a couple things that were like, okay, this is the end of the era. But historians wouldn't really say on this day at this time, the Cold War ended. It's not going to be like that. It's very different. It was very open, very fluid. We're talking the span of about 50 years. The Cold War wasn't like a 4-year skirmish between different countries. It was 50 years of half of the world fighting against the spread of communism. 50 years. There were wars within the Cold War. Okay, so now that you know the big picture, let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm on your second note page, which is the Iron Curtain divides Europe. All right, so in this, you'll see on my notes that I've already done, you're going to be coloring about half of Europe, one color, and about half of Europe, the other color. And what this is this is a defining line of where communism was and where it was not. And you'll see at the key at the very top, it talks about, or I'm sorry, it mentions the Warsaw Pact and NATO. Okay, so if you were a Warsaw Pact member, you are most likely in a communist country. And if you were a member of NATO, you were not in a communist country. You were most likely a democratic country. Okay, so what we're doing is we're taking our map and we're literally splitting it right in the middle is what it feels like. And you'll see there's a little cutout. You're going to cut out this little triangle and you're going to glue it, and it's going to be a flap up. And it's almost like we're making a curtain, right? It's going to be an iron curtain that divides Europe. This was terminology that was coined to represent the hard stop between communists and non-communists. Communist countries were holding on tight to their regime. They did not want their countries going to a democratic way because they would lose control. Okay, and what we were seeing was communist people were fleeing their communist country because they recognized the control that these dictators had over them and their families and their economy, and it wasn't working. And so we will see that in a little bit play out even more, but members of these countries didn't really love that they were communist countries, okay? The leaders wanted it, and they were doing everything they could to make sure they could hang on to that power and keep that political control. And so there's a hard stopping line, an ending line of where communism kind of began, or I'm sorry, where communism played out in Europe. So it was split into communist, not communist country. And so you'll glue this little flap and it will make like a curtain showing you the distinction and the division between Europe, between the communist and non-communist countries. Okay, so after World War II, we had a group of people come together at Yalta and other events and other conferences and things as well. But the Allied forces pretty much got together and they said, you know what? We have recognized that maybe leaving Germany alone after World War I was a bad idea, right? Appeasement, where we were trying to keep everyone happy, it didn't work. Enter World War II. Okay, so now here they are talking after World War II about how can we make sure there isn't a World War III? How can we make sure that we can control Germany a little bit better than we did before? And so what they decided to do is, this is before Cold War, right? But this is the background that you need to know in order for our next page to make any sense. What they decided to do after World War II is some of the major powers in the good guys of World War II who were trying to create peace in the world, so France, England, America, they all came together and they said, you know what? Let's take Berlin. Let's take the capital of Germany and kind of keep our eyes on them and our ears on them and make sure their government is obeying the way that we are saying the world should be run. Let's make sure their military doesn't get too big. So they got together, They all had a zone in Berlin. Now, what was interesting about this city was outside of the fact it was the capital city and it was not controlled by Germans, right? It's the capital city of Germany, not controlled by Germans at all. The interesting part outside of that, which is unique in and of itself, is that completely all around Berlin was all communists. All right, I'm going to show you on our map right here. That is the teeny tiny city of Berlin, that little spot on our map. And over here, they've zoomed out so you can see Berlin up close with all the different zones. All right, so I want to chat about the Berlin airlift. All right, so German occupation was obviously not positive. And so in an effort to keep Berlin and to keep them a little bit more controlled, a little bit toned down, what happened was this occupation of Berlin, the Germans didn't like it. That was their city, that was their capital, and they wanted it back. And so they kind of came together and they said, you know what? Let's try to kick all these other people out. And it wasn't even necessarily just the Germans, it was all of the communists, right? And one of the biggest pushes, one of the countries who pushed the most for communism was the Soviet Union, mostly because they were the largest. They're a massive, massive country. And so the Soviets came and they said, you know what? Berlin is completely surrounded by communists, and we want Berlin. We want to capture back the city of Berlin for the communist cause. Let's smoke them out, so to speak. They tried to starve them and limit supplies. They put a blockade around the city of Berlin so that people who were not their people, so communists, could do whatever they wanted, but non-communists couldn't get in. They couldn't get in to help the French zone or the English zone or the American zone. So they ended up running out of medical supplies, and they were running out of food and clean water and any resource that they needed to live there. And so what was happening was the Soviets were trying to get them, to force them to just give up and say, okay, we need food and we need medicine. You can have your capital city back. We quit, we leave, we're going home because we need food to survive and we need medicine to keep going. And it kind of backfired on them. What happened instead was the Allied forces came together and said, you know what, we can't drive into Berlin to give resources to our people because the communists have put a blockade around the city. So let's fly it in. And so they got airplanes together and they put all the medicine, all the food, all the water, all the resources that their American people, their English people, their French people needed in their zone in Berlin. And they literally put it on an airplane and they flew it over the city and dropped it right into the zone wherever they needed and kept going on their merry way. And this continued for some weeks until the Soviets finally realized, well, darn it, they outsmarted us. And that didn't work. And so eventually the Soviets kind of gave up and they let the supplies trickle into the zones on land. But it's a very well-known resistance to communist endeavors of taking over the city of Berlin, because Berlin represented more than just a city. It was the capital of Germany. So that's a really huge deal in history, the Berlin airlift. Okay, the next sheet looks like this. It looks like a little windmill. It is the Marshall Plan. So in America, after World War II, we have, excuse me, President Truman, who recognizes that there are some communist countries and there are some countries who are not identified as communist yet, but they are falling apart because after World War II, they've been blown to pieces and their economy is tanking, and they don't have the funds, the money, the resources to rebuild their cities so they can have jobs, so people can work, so the economy will come back, and there will be trade, right? And so President Truman got this plan together, this initiative called the Marshall Plan, and what he was trying to do was give financial aid to many European countries after World War II that were devastated by the war. And so the hope of it was that they would first be able to rebuild and boost their economy so that we could have international trade. But secondly, probably the underlying reason was that they wanted this country to prosper and do well and have a government that was succeeding and an economy that was going up so that they did not fall to the Soviets. So the Soviets didn't come in and take control of this very weak, politically unstable little country and take them for the cause of communism. So while, yes, it was to help these European countries rebuild, it was also mostly to stop the spread of communism. So it was kind of a double whammy, but that's really what it was. The U.S. gave money to some of these European countries, even parts of Germany, to rebuild after the World War II, after the devastation of World War II, to boost international trade and the economy, but also to stop the spread of communism. All right, so the next page in your notes says post-war organizations. Now, this is a homework sheet for you. When you complete this, I want you to upload it to your notes and send it to me. Send me a little message and say, hey, Mrs. Sadler, I went ahead and uploaded my notes page for the post-war organizations. And you will be looking into, using your textbook or the internet, what exactly were some of these post-World War II organizations that I've been talking about. Warsaw, you've been talking about that, right? The Warsaw Pact. NATO, the United Nations. There's three of them. The Warsaw Pact, NATO, and United Nations. I've already kind of talked about them a little bit, but what exactly were they? Where were they? What was decided? Okay, this is one of your homework sheets on top of the section quizzes. All right, containment and the Truman policy. That's the page I'm on next. All right, so containment is a word that was coined by President Truman, by President Harry Truman, and it means stopping the spread of communism. So in his government rule, he would talk about a lot of policies to encourage containment. And he would, create like the Marshall Plan. We would say that was a containment initiative. Now, if you were alive in this era, you know what that meant. So for all of us who were not, what he means by containment is stopping the spread of communism, containing communism so it doesn't get any bigger, and we can keep as many democratic countries as possible and as few dictators and harsh rulers and communist countries as possible. Okay, so on this page, you're cutting out like a little file folder, and there's 3 pages that you're going to put into this containment file, and on each page is how each country or each part of the world kind of helped during the containment policy, and how specifically how the Americans helped with containment in those parts of the world. So we've already talked about Western Europe, but he used the Marshall Plan to give money to non-communist countries, and Truman also gave aid to Greece when there was a civil war going on, because the communist side was winning. They were winning, and that Greece was getting ready to be taken as a communist country. So Truman came in, and the Americans gave a little bit of aid to the non-communist half of Greece, and they were able to win this little civil war that was in Greece, and they were able to avoid being added to the list of communist countries. So that's another way that the U.S. contained communism in Western Europe. And finally, in Turkey, something very similar. The Americans gave aid and support to help them stay a democratic country. Now, in Latin America, we have guerrillas and little civil wars popping up in all of these countries, and pretty much the U.S. granted aid to any country that was trying to fight communism. Okay, so they gave help, they gave assistance, they helped them become modernized, they wanted to help them develop their economy, They wanted to help them develop their military so they could fight against communist regimes who were trying to come in and take over. And then finally, the last page that will go in your containment file is Asia. Okay, so the last little one is Asia. And this is where um, the Americans actually went to war. This was one of the actual physical battles where we weren't just helping, we weren't just talking to governments, we weren't just giving aid to other countries. We sent our soldiers to these countries to physically fight a war against communism. And so this actually is very relevant to today. We see some of the effects of this today. So specifically on our page, I want you to write down that the Americans went to war with Korea to prevent communism from spreading from North Korea to South Korea. So we joined forces with the South Korean soldiers and fought against North Korea. And then we also went to war with Vietnam because they were pushing a communist country. And so they were again split. There's a civil war going on in Vietnam. And we tried to partner with the soldiers who were trying to fight against Vietnam being taken as or being pushed as a communist country. And this is important because this is very recent. When we look at the scope of all the history that we've learned this year, we're talking like 1200s, 1300s, right? Louis the 14th, where we went all the way from France, the French Revolution. We've covered a lot in history this year. This is history that maybe hits us a little bit closer to home. Maybe you know someone who fought in the Korean War or the Vietnam War. Maybe you know someone who is affected by this. I can share personal stories. My grandfather fought in the Korean War. He has a Purple Heart from the fight against communism in Korea, and he has scoured, when he came home, and he has things that we keep as his grandkids. We have his helmet, and he's still living, but he has his helmet that he used when he was in the army, and just different things that we have seen and held and touched. And so the Korean War is very near and dear to my heart because he fought in it and has pictures of it, and he's lost friends on the battlefield of the Korean War. And I've grown up hearing stories about the Korean War my whole life. And as for the Vietnam War, I tutor privately on the side. And one of the families that I have tutored for years now, years and years, the mother is Vietnamese. And this was post the Vietnam War. However, when she was 8 years old, she was a refugee. Her and her family left Vietnam. They fled Vietnam on a boat by night. They secretly had to leave because they were not allowed to leave. This isn't a country where you can just travel because you want to. They wanted to go visit. Their dad had left years before, and they lost touch with him because this was an era where you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have the internet, right? So it was very different than it is today. They couldn't keep in touch. They thought he had died. It had been so long since they had heard from him. He had never sent a letter to them to say, hey, I got out and here's where I ended up. They just assumed that he had died trying to escape Vietnam. And so several years passed. When she was 8 years old, her mom gathered her and her siblings, and I think they went with an uncle, and they fled the country by boat at night and ended up in a refugee camp, and over time became legal citizens in the United States. And a couple years into living in the United States, their dad found them. They got a letter. Some of the family members that knew where they had ended up were able to share with the dad when he came back. They're all alive, and this is where they are. And so the dad was able to write a letter, and she says that's her first memory of her dad, is when he came home to visit them in America, because they all had assumed that he had passed away. And so he had said, I didn't want to send a letter to them because he was afraid that they wouldn't get it because the government was so controlling, and that it would give up their location or his location where he was, and they would come and kill him. And then also that they would start watching, the government would start watching that family very closely if they found out they were trying to escape. So he was afraid to send a letter because it was so dangerous. And so I've heard these stories my whole life. So this Cold War era, it was a long time ago, but it was really, really recent. I guarantee you, your maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, they might have stories about this Cold War era or the Vietnam War or the Korean War. And I would encourage you to ask them, do you know anything about this? What do you remember being on the news? So I'm going to keep moving because I feel like I want to make sure that I'm using the best use of our time so that I'm not using up too much of yours. But the next sheet that you will have for your notes is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this looks really kind of weird, but you're going to cut it out as normal. And I have mine already done. So what you're going to do is you're going to fill in your notes, cut it out, and you're going to fold it into thirds like this. And you see how it looks like a missile now? So you're going to glue that straight in your notebooks, and now you can cut a little bit better than I did. This is just supposed to be the haze from the missile. Okay, so let's chat about the Cuban Missile Crisis really quickly. All right, so the Cold War is where we are fighting against the Soviets and the spread of communism. All right, so the Soviet Union began to install nuclear weapons and missiles, and they were not supposed to. What they did, because they could not reach from where they were, they started building them in Cuba, which was really close to America. And so the American government went, hold up, no way. And so everyone was kind of like scared and tense and nervous that the Russians, or I guess the Soviets at the time, the Soviets are putting these missiles in Cuba, which is right next to us, and we're going to have this nuclear war. Everyone was freaking out and paranoid about this possible nuclear war that was coming. And so eventually what happened is the president at the time, President Kennedy, JFK, he decided to figure out a way, these missiles gotta go, okay? So he got the US forces together and they tried to overthrow the dictator, Fidel Castro, and he did an invasion called the Bay of Pigs, the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. And while it didn't work, because they were not successful in overthrowing Fidel Castro kind of realized, I don't want to be at war with the Americans, right? So the whole mission was to overthrow the dictatorship. And while that didn't work, it did give Fidel Castro cause to say, this is not what I want. I don't want you guys coming in here and putting missiles for them to be mad at me and fighting me in my country. And so it gave Fidel Castro cause to stop. And it was like a warning sign to him that he didn't want to be at war with America. And so eventually what happened is Kennedy used a blockade around Cuba. People couldn't get in, people couldn't get out, supplies couldn't get in or out. And Cuba was a very tiny country, right? So, and they're an island, so there was no one that could just drive them things. And so the US put this blockade around them, and it took 13 days where Americans were like, what is going to happen? Is this going to work? Are we getting ready to go to war because they're going to shoot their missiles at us? But after 13 days of top secret negotiations and a bunch of different behind the scenes conversations, Kennedy convinced Cuba to stop and to not allow the Soviet Union to keep building these nuclear missiles, and the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles, which obviously they didn't love. But that is what the Cuban Missile Crisis is. And let's see. Yep, I think I covered it. So the Soviet Union had to get rid of their missiles that they had put into Cuba. The next page in your sheet is going to be the later Cold War vocab sheet. You know what to do with this as well. You're going to copy, paste, and then write the definition behind each vocabulary flap. Let's see. Okay, so the next one I'm going to give you is comparing the Vietnam and Korean Wars. Again, I've kind of already touched on both of these. This is where The Americans came in and there was civil war in Vietnam and there was civil war in Korea. Half the country was communist, half the country was fighting against communism. And so the Americans came in and partnered with them. They sent them food and financial aid and weapons and soldiers to help them win the fight against communism in their country, right, in Vietnam and in Korea. So we've kind of chatted about that already. So what I want you to do is a little bit of reading, a little bit of research, and you're for homework going to do the the Venn diagram for Vietnam and Korean War. So on one side, I want what you're figuring out or what you're learning about the Korean War. On the other side, Vietnam. And in the middle, what do they both have in common? So what in the middle, what do the Vietnam War and the Korean War, what do they both have in common? Okay, so the next page, and actually let me chat about that. I'll get to that on the timeline. Sorry. Okay, so the next page, we're almost done, guys. We've got 2 more. This page is going to be a quick one. This is the perspectives on the Vietnam War. We've done things like this where we compare and contrast different perspectives or different people in politics before. So what we're looking at is on one side, you see we have like this hippie guy. He's called a dove. And on the other side, we have a soldier holding a little American flag, and he's labeled as a hawk. Because of the Vietnam War, our country was very divided. They had the hippies, the free spirits that are all about peace and love. We should never have to go to war because people should be able to talk and come to a common agreement. And war, if we do things right, we would never have to have another war ever again, okay? And they were mad that America was fighting in Vietnam because it had nothing to do with America. It's unjust. We're killing thousands of our young soldiers, and we just shouldn't be in it, right? And then on the other side, you have the guy that's dressed up as a soldier. Now, it doesn't mean just soldiers or just military. He represents the other half of America that thought we should be fighting in the Vietnam War. We are one of the biggest democratic nations. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We have one of the best militaries. Why would we not want to join the cause and fight for people who cannot fight for themselves? Why would we allow these poor, lesser people to be controlled by these communist dictators if we can help them win? Right? And so it wasn't even necessarily about America. It was about, this is our job as a strong, powerful country to help those who are weaker and don't have as much power and money and weapons as we do. And so they were all about fighting to defend our place in the world and fighting to protect ourselves and other smaller countries. And they thought communism was evil and it should be defeated. Okay, so those were the 2 leading perspectives of the Vietnam War, and it actually divided our country so much. Our country was so split and so divided over fighting in the Vietnam War that eventually the Americans withdrew from the war before it really won, right? We still see turbulence in Vietnam today, but we withdrew from the Vietnam War because there was so much political unrest between the 2 sides in the American culture. So what they did instead of staying to fight was they took the Vietnam soldiers who were fighting against the communists in Vietnam, and they gave them weapons and they gave them training, and they tried to support their soldiers as much as possible so that we would stop sending our soldiers to fight the war, okay? And then the last page that you have, it's actually a 2-page spread, is the timeline of the Cold War, all right? And we have chatted about most of this, so I'm just going to get some highlights, okay? We talked about Yalta in the very beginning. 3 bigwigs came together and decided what the world would look like after World War II. We have Winston Churchill, FDR, so President Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. And they all kind of came together about How can we move forward, avoid World War III, have peace? And I kind of already talked about that towards the beginning. The Korean War, we've already covered that in detail, but one thing I want to cover really quickly, it's so blurry because it's so dark in my office, but at the bottom of it of this page is the 38th parallel, and that's important because the country even today was divided. So after the after the Korean War ended, when we left Korea, the country still remained divided by the 38th parallel. And so there's a big sign that says you are now crossing the 38th parallel. And what that means is you're getting ready to enter into communist land. So we hear today about North Korea all the time, right? North Korea, South Korea, and the merging of them and the politics between them, their own arguments between the war or between the country itself. There has been turbulence in Korea literally since the 50s, probably since the 50s. And so after the Korean War, after we withdrew, it wasn't really ever over for the Koreans. And so the 38th parallel is what divides the country between communists and not communists. And I've already talked about the Bay of Pigs invasion where FDR tried to overthrow Fidel Castro in detail, so I'm going to skip over that slide. Right in between them, you'll see a wall. I'm sure you've heard of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall pretty much is when I was talking about the Berlin airlift and how people were trying to contain communism and get Berlin so they could keep communism in Germany. In Germany, in the city of Berlin, they were divided by communist policies. Some of Germany was communist, some of Germany was not. And what they were recognizing was that all of the people were learning as time went on, wait a minute, over there, where it's not communist, their economy is awesome. There's more jobs, there's more money, there's more peace, we have a little bit more say. And so people were fleeing communist Germany and going to other cities in Germany that were not communist. And so what they did is literally overnight, German forces got together and constructed a wall of concrete slabs and barbed wire, and they made this massive fence that was like 10, 15 feet high. No one could get over it. And overnight, the people woke up and saw this wall where they could no longer escape from the grips of communism. This wall spanned 90-something miles. 90-something miles. Imagine driving from here to 90 miles, and the whole way there's this huge wall separating them from non-communist parts of the country. That is what the Berlin Wall is. The Berlin Wall, even to this day, is a huge symbol of communism and the communist power in Europe. Okay, so over time, they constructed a real wall that wasn't just barbed wire, but they came back over time and slowly built it up to be this massive wall, this massive structure. But it's definitely a picture of communism. And even now, if you said to your parents or your grandparents, what does the Berlin Wall make you think of? They're going to say communism or dictators. They might say Cold War, right? That is a very prominent piece of history. Okay, one thing that maybe you have never heard of, most likely, are the McCarthy hearings, the Army versus McCarthy hearings. So what happened was there was this senator named Joseph McCarthy, and he started giving falsely claiming that higher ups in the American government and politics were infiltrated with communists. And pretty much what was happening is he started paranoia among the American people, and he started accusing many of the higher government officials of being communists and trying to infiltrate communist policies into the government and trying to take over the government secretly. And so he was causing all this paranoia and this hysteria among the government, among the American people. And so the U.S. Army sued him, and they went to court. And the U.S. Army versus the McCarthy hearings are what is known as them arguing against him and trying to get him to stop these witch hunts in the in politics, in the government. And over time, what happened, your question on here is, who was he? What was he known for? And what happened to him as a result? Over time, he ended up being completely removed, obviously, and the public started tuning him out and focusing on containment the way Truman wanted them to. But that's kind of something that we probably don't hear about very much. But it was a big deal in American politics. I'm sure you've heard of the paranoia about spies and communists and Sputnik, and the American people were kind of paranoid that the communists were going to come in and take over, or they were already living right next to us and they were spying on everything that's going on in our country. This is kind of one of those things that fed into that paranoia. He was falsely accusing high government officials, and people were questioning the government, like, wait a minute, can I trust you? Do we not trust you? Everyone was scared. And then you had the missiles going on in Cuba, right? It was not a very good time for people's mental health. They were freaking out about some of these things. And so the McCarthy hearings, the Army versus McCarthy hearings, that's just one piece of where that paranoia came from. Okay, so our last sheet, the other side of the timeline of the Cold War, talks about the Vietnam War, which I feel like I've covered. There's a little blurb in there about Nixon. He visited China because it had been 25 years since anyone from America had tried to build the bridge and have positive ties of communication with China. So he did that. And then finally, we see the end of the Cold War era. Now, I talked at the very beginning about how the Cold War is unique in that there is no starting date, an ending date of the Cold War. There's no one specific event with a date and a time the way there is for the majority of the other wars. However, the Cold War is recognized, the end of the Cold War is kind of when the fall of the Berlin Wall happened. So the Berlin Wall came down, and it kind of signified the end of this war against communism. That was kind of a biggie, right? So over time, 40 years and years and years, 40 or 50 years, I think it was like 1989, the end of 1989, before the Berlin Wall ended up coming down. The German government decided to bring it down. People were finally able to leave. Imagine that. They couldn't leave if they wanted to. They had to have a passport to go visit another part of their country. And so they were finally able to go back and forth wherever they wanted in their country. And so it united Germany. They got rid of communism. So the fall of the Berlin Wall is definitely a symbol that the Cold War had ended. But what really put the nail in the coffin for the Cold War is the collapse of the Soviet Union. So politically, over time, the Soviet Union kind of was spiraling downward, and economically, they were in a tough spot. Finally, several countries within the Soviet Union finally decided to secede, to withdraw from the Union and kind of be their own country. They were no longer a part of the Soviet Union. This would be like if Georgia decided they didn't want to be in America anymore, and they made their own little country of Georgia. And then Iowa said, you know what? This really isn't working for us. We're going to be our own country too. And so Iowa would secede from the United States and become the country of Iowa. Okay, that's kind of what happened in the Soviet Union. Politically, economically, there was complete instability, and all the countries, many of the countries within the Soviet Union, decided to secede one by one by one. And after several countries seceded from the Union, the Soviet Union literally just collapsed. And we mark that obviously as the end, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it also marks the end of the Cold War because, like I said in the very beginning, the Cold War was primarily America fighting against Soviet Union's push for communism. If you take out the Soviet Union and you take out the communist policies that they had in place, there was nothing left for us to fight, okay? So the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union solidified the end of the Cold War. And then, of course, the Soviet Union today is what we know as Russia, okay? So Soviet Union, no more. Communism, no more. Now we have Russia. And while there is communism throughout the world, it was not nearly what it was during the Cold War era. Okay, guys, that is it. Your notes are for homework. You will want to upload the two that I showed you, both the post-war organizations of NATO, United Nations, and the Warsaw Pact. And then secondly, the Venn diagram comparing and contrasting the Vietnam War and the Korean War. And then you have to do your section quizzes. But other than that, this completes the instruction for the Cold War. So let me know if you have any questions. Other than that, you guys have a wonderful weekend.